welcome to the Abbey of Santa Maria de la Vide as we continue to celebrate 40 years of Norbertine presence in New Mexico. I'm Dr. Joseph Sandoval, the Director of Communications here at the Abbey, and we are here today for the concluding event in the Library Lecture Series titled God in Recovery. It has been a fantastic series so far, as over the past several months, we have had 3 incredible speakers present here as part of the events. We've invited all 3 speakers back today and for a concluding symposium. So to tell you more about the event today, as well as the speakers, please welcome the founder of the Library Lecture Series, as well as the Abbey Community's prior, the very Reverend Father Stephen Gertner.
Thank you. Well, I'm very pleased to be with all of you today for this concluding symposium. I don't want to stand in front of our presenters here because they're the stars of the show. So we've been on a journey, since last fall with this topic, dealing with storytelling, healing, and of course, really the encompassing glue of spirituality. And it's been just I think a wonderful experience that we've had going through the different, sort of angles of approach that our presenters, McKenna and Kate Horsley and Lynne, Hinton, noted authors all have offered with respect to this overarching topic, sort of bringing their own experiences and expertise to this conversation. But the thing that has struck me now is that where we are wrapping this up in our sort of unique point in time is that I think if there was one word that I would have to encapsulate this entire lecture series for 2024-2025, it would be one word: timely. Timely. Because we are living, as the ancient Chinese curse recounts it, in interesting times. And, the notions of trauma, healing, and where storytelling, where narrative fits into that, I think, right now is at an inflection point. And I'm going to push on that a little bit more as we move closer, to the conversation portion of this concluding symposium. But without any further remarks from myself, I'll keep that in reserve. We'll begin with a brief encapsulation from each of our presenters with respect to, I'd say the main points of, how they were approaching this topic, and then from there we will begin, I would say, a rather free-form conversation and just really see where it goes. And so, just to our presenters, just make sure when you're speaking, use the microphone so that we can make sure we're picking up all the sound that we can. And I think Lynne, you were the first presenter, so you will go first.
Hello, I'm Lynne Hinton, and what I bring to this symposium, as well as to the conversation that I led around addiction, has to do with the fact that I teach journaling for a county program here in Bernalillo County, so that there is an older adult program, a young adult program, a substance abuse recovery unit, and a crisis services unit, so 2-week stay, also managed by the county. So I come in teaching journaling, but certainly have learned a lot about storytelling within these programs. Part of what I used in my conversation came from Dr. Richard Rohr's book with regards to the 12-step program and spirituality, breathing underwater. His book was very helpful to me, as was Sonia Walter's book on pastoral care and addiction. But the storytelling aspect has been very important for me as someone who comes into that program with regards to the stories that people tell about their addictions, but also the thoughts they have around the stories that they tell. I think in my talk I gave some ideas of stories that people believe about themselves in these programs. Number one, that they believe they're no better than their addiction. They don't think very highly of themselves, have a real struggle with forgiving themselves. So the story of healing for me and working with them has to start with giving their story the authority, as well as saying, you know, this story is painful and hard, but it doesn't define you. I was thinking too, this past week I have started a young adult program, or I didn't start it, the young adult program has started, and that's a real different kind of energy than older adults in a program. This past week it kind of unraveled, and I'm still processing exactly what happened. But I think for some younger people, just the sense of survival is a part of what their stories have been. It's just survival, being left alone when they were children, raised in situations of poverty and abuse. So part of my experience now with them has been informed by Gregory Boyle's latest book, which is Cherished Belonging, and understanding that my role in these programs is simply to cherish them, to greet them with love and a true welcome, both in their stories of pain and stories of addiction, but also with the hope of a story of healing. So that was a little bit about what I was presenting on my occasion.
Okay. I'm Kate Horsley Parker, actually. That's my full name that I was born with. But I write under the name Kate Horsley. And I would say that dysfunctional relationships are things that I have a direct relationship with in many ways. I think many of us do. And that has to do with family of origin and all kinds of relationships. And it also, I'm very familiar with how dysfunctional relationships are a core part of a lot of literature. In terms of my dealing with how to heal those things, I feel that definitely spiritual path is a big part of that for me. And as I said in my talk, I am mostly guided by philosophy and religion. The philosopher that I am completely enamored with is well known, Socrates. And I feel that Socrates' approach to just dysfunctional relationships and everything that causes suffering is very straightforward and really has been helpful to me. And at the same time, I have a very deep practice in Zen Buddhism, and in that practice I include God, and that is not an unusual thing. Some people think that Zen Buddhism is a godless path, but it is not necessarily. And as I was saying earlier and said in my talk, that there's a Catholic priest who runs many of this meditation retreats named Father Kennedy, and then there was, of course, Merton, who was a very devout Catholic and also on the Zen path. What does the Zen path do for me or do for anybody who's dealing with dysfunctional relationships? I think there's just one question in all of these things, and it is, what causes suffering? Just to look at what that I say or do, might say or do, would cause suffering. But, I think we have to be somewhat honest with ourselves that we're capable of causing suffering. So that's kind of the basis of my talk. Was also really that the most important dysfunctional relationship, and that goes with what I just said, is the relationship one has with oneself. And that means how true we are to ourselves, how honest we are with ourselves about what we do that causes the relationship to be dysfunctional. Or to be honest with ourselves of what we're looking for and getting into a relationship that's dysfunctional. What fantasy, what ego trip, or whatever you want to call it. So that's an overview of what I was talking about and what I write about a lot in my work too.
I specifically tried to deal with trauma. Everyone experiences trauma individually, but the trauma I was concerned about is not necessarily one-on-one. It is the larger trauma events that encompass an entire group of people. For the last 5 years, I have spent most of my time in the Northwest Territories of Northern Canada working with First Nations. They are a people that were born into trauma and have lived through trauma for 4 generations. They deal with every kind of personal trauma, from murder and disappearances, to alcoholism, to personal abuse, to poverty, massive violence, hatred, exclusion from life itself in many ways. And yet they are a people that have not only survived for 4 generations under incredible circumstances, just even the weather and survival, they live with grace. And they have learned how to live, not just surviving trauma, but somehow resurrecting a new life out of trauma and redeeming what they have had to experience. My other 2 panel folk basically concentrated a lot on the one-on-one and the storytelling. The first step in dealing with trauma is telling your story. That is a universal phenomena. In large groups of people, it also becomes a major problem because everyone is telling that story. And even the people they talk to, they are telling that same story to with different specifics of who and when and what, etc. But the outcomes are all the same. The sense of isolation, the sense of disconnect from their own person, from their own bodies, from any kind of reality, coupled with a sense that they're not, the words they use, they're not worth anything. They don't see themselves as human because other people don't treat them that way. So the last 5 years I've been working with them has not been, part of their individual stories always come out because it's built into our psyches. But there's a rule in storytelling. The story begins when the teller stops talking. And so most of what I have dealt with in the area of trauma is what happens when you stop telling your story or when you should stop telling your story. Because the story constantly repeated can become part of the trauma and part of the destruction of what follows. So I was always thinking when I spoke of groups of people. The story I used in the gospel was from the Gospel of John, the main resurrection story at night when Jesus breaks into the locked room where they are living in fear and greets them with the words of peace be with you. And peace is a command. It's a greeting, it's a blessing, but it's also a command. The resurrection account is the peace of God, wholeness, harmony, balance, the way human life was meant to be. Peace be with you. And the story is the giving of that peace, but it is also the giving of the command to go forth and be peace with other people, to spread that. most of the people I have worked with who have dealt with trauma over long periods of time say that part of the healing of trauma is to share that with others. It's anything they have learned, they have experienced, they have come to know. Now they must share it with others. Maya Angelou has two marvelous sayings I use a lot. One is, the deepest pain we carry is the untold story within us. That's the first piece. The second piece is, once you have any level of freedom, you must share it with other people. And that if you don't, then you haven't reached a level where you can respond to your trauma and continue your story with some sort of gracefulness and power and freedom. I chose the story not just because of Jesus giving peace, but because of who wasn't there. The story is that the 10 disciples are there. Judas, of course, has committed suicide, which is one of the normal responses to trauma. And Thomas, whose name means an identical twin, wasn't there. And the understanding among most exegetes these days is he deliberately chose not to be there because he did not want to be associated with anyone who knew Jesus, and therefore would not associate with his other brothers as disciples of Jesus. So he has, in a sense, betrayed Jesus, but he's also betrayed his community, which is part of what happens with trauma. And the second half of that story is, a week later he does show up, but he has not believed any of the others, and therefore he has caused trauma himself and visited that on the other disciples. And so when Jesus comes the second time, the message hasn't changed. Peace be with you. But this time he turns on Thomas and confronts him with his behavior and the effect it has had on others. They've been given peace of Christ. They've been given a sense of his presence. They have been given the command to go and to share that good news. And they've also been given the power of the Spirit to forgive and to hold others bound, to hold them responsible for their behaviors. And even with all of that, they did nothing. And so he turns on Thomas, who is the root cause, and says, and confronts him in such a way, using his own words, that it's like, okay, you don't believe, do this. And Thomas's reason, what he gives as reasons for not believing in Jesus and not believing in his brothers is, I won't believe until I can stick my fingers in the wounds in his hands, stick my hand as a fist into his side, and basically to open the wounds again and cause him to bleed and to deepen the pain. And so he uses his own words to confront him and saying, go ahead, do it. I always ask people, do you think he moved? And no one ever says he ever did. And what he says is, oh, my Lord and my God. And the way Jesus answers that is, basically the tone is, get off of it. You only said that because you already got what you want. And therefore, Jesus' last words in the original ending, John, is, blessed are those who didn't see, who didn't get their agenda dealt with, and yet they still believe. That the second step in dealing with trauma is to face the truth about what it has done to you, but what you also have done to other people. To witness, to speak and name the trauma. And name it in such a way that it's not just your own personal trauma, but it is something others share and have a part in. When the trauma, we forget sometimes, we have a tendency when we talk about trauma to talk about it so singularly or individually that we forget that Most trauma is caused by a number of other people and a number of other factions that an individual tries to deal with. The thing I've learned from working with all these past years is you have to deal with it with other people. You must reach a point in facing trauma where it is not one-on-one. It's not just me and another person. You have got to deal with it communally. And the only way to really heal from trauma is in a community. And as a part of a community tore you to shreds, then it's also a part of a community that puts you back together again, heals you, and allows you to move on from that. So that is, I concentrated more on a sense of dealing with your trauma within a context of other people, so that it's not just an individual person who grows and learn. You don't learn to live with it, you learn to transform it and use it as a bedrock for something else. So that was where I approached it from. And so today when we gathered together, I worked on a little bit of what does it look like for the future? What does it mean that when we say these kinds of things or share them with other people, where do we go from here? So that's where I am.
Well, thank you. And I think we learned one thing is that that's the mic that works.
Yes.
So I think this is one that the one you guys were using, that one, I don't think it's picking anything up. So let's just use this guy right here. And so to start, maybe just open it up for some questions. So I'll begin, and I'll start with Lynne Hinton first. Is one of the things that we think about addiction, would be, I'd say, be similar to like family dysfunction. I'd say as well is that there seems to be a constant, and that is with respect to the wounds that addiction inflicts on the person that is afflicted with the addiction, but also the people that it affects in their life, that there's a code of silence. Whereas I think they would talk about it in like Gothic literature, it's the family secret, it's the unspeakable, the thing that we can't ever talk about, but that's always the elephant in the room. And so when there's a repression of that narrative that this person is ill, is doing an immense amount of harm to themselves and to others in their family and in their community in some cases, but there's the code of silence. We can't talk about it. And I can remember even from my own family, that was sort of how those things, we had skeletons in our family, like every family just about, and that was how it was dealt with. That was the learned mechanism of coping, is you just don't talk about it. And there was substance abuse and other things, but every now and then my grandmother would, the way she would mention it is she would kind of get at some of these things that had happened and people that had for example, dealt with alcoholism in the family and so forth, but and she would every now and then allude to things that had happened, but then she would always conclude whatever remarks that she had, and in some cases those remarks had more than a barb on them with, and that's another name that we never mention around here anymore, and that would be the end of the conversation. We just don't talk about that person or what they did, and so it's the thing that we see with addiction is in many cases one of the modalities is in the healing process and working the steps, the amends, or the person that is making amends for the harm that the addiction has caused, hears the people that have been affected by the addiction and say, this is what happened, and then the person is, I own that this is what happened, and that the place of rationalization and minimizing and that is gone, and it's about, I have to hear this person's narrative, I have to hear the harm that has been done and be willing to make amends for it. And then, the other side of it is, as you see in some cases at recovery meetings, is that, recovering addicts or alcoholics, they tell their story. But now it's a story that, just as Megan was talking about this notion of the truth or honesty, it's now based in honesty. It's no longer a manipulation or a rationalization or a self-serving enterprise, but it's like, this is what I was like, this is what happened, and this is what I'm like now. And that the truth can be embraced finally. And as they talk about it in Peace and Reconciliation and Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. The story has to be told, the truth has to be told, but then it allows us to remember in a new way. And so I guess my opening salvo for you is, have you found in your work that people are able to, in telling their stories, in relating the stories of what addiction has done, are they able to engage the full truth? And where does that sometimes still run aground where people are really struggling to accept that this is the narrative, or in some cases where they maybe still have trouble reconciling their experience maybe of the addiction with other people's experience of the addiction. I mean, is that still something that causes problems in your experience in the healing and the recovery process?
What my experience is with folks in rehab is the lack of ability to forgive themselves. They're very much in touch with how much damage they have caused, it seems to me. But that ability to receive the forgiveness, which I think also speaks to staying in addiction. If you think you're worthless and there is no redemption for you and there is no forgiveness and no love enough for you, then you can stay in your addiction. It's one of those stories that I think they tell themselves about themselves, is that I've been told I'm a drunk, I'm going to be a drunk, that's all I have. So part of what I feel like I bring into the program with journaling and poetry and writing is that sense of what will help you get to a place where you can forgive yourself for what has been done. I really struggled a couple of weeks ago. I had invited them to tell stories of a narrative that someone believes about them or has shared about them that has been painful to them. And so one man tells the story of his daughter coming and just laying it on the line that he was a terrible father and she hates him and never wants to see him again. And that was the end of the story. And I struggled with, well, what good news do I have to bring to him? Because that's not the final story. There's a possibility that there could be reconciliation with this daughter. But that finality that he felt in knowing that relationship is over and her narrative is the only narrative that is true, that possibility that there could be a new narrative, and to me where I see the biggest struggle has to do with that lack of being able to forgive themselves.
Well, I think that's a wonderful jumping off point for the question that I'm going to direct to Dr. Horsley, and that is, if you think about not being able to forgive oneself, that is the sense that if the new narrative, the healing narrative, is that there was this affliction, there was this dysfunction, there was this problem, and even though the problem is now being addressed, the truth is out there. Somehow the narrative cannot become something life-giving. In the sense of learning from it, growing from it, offering something, to others, as a way to also heal and grow and what have you. That it just stops with the fact that I'm a horrible person, and that no matter how many, that in a sense becomes the new site of contest where people are even support a family member and friends like, no, you're more than that. No, I'm not. And then that becomes the new battle in a weird sort of way. And that's sort of kind of my jumping off point. Your topic was the family dysfunction and healing. And the thing that I think we're seeing a lot now, and I'd say this is where it starts to engage kind of our current zeitgeist or sort of standpoint in history, so to speak, with all the division that we have in our society is what happens when narrative ceases to be within a family, within a community, within a polity even. What happens when narrative ceases to be a tool of healing and reconciliation, but rather when it becomes something that in and of itself is weaponized? And I think we'll start with the family in that if you think about Many families where there's dysfunction, there's usually an originary or original event, something, a rupture, something, a wound, something that happens that a sister versus a sister, or a brother versus a brother, or a parent versus child, what have you. Something that happens that, in the midst of time, that all parties seem to remember it in a different way, and to assign culpability in a different way. This person did it, and I was just reacting to this horrible thing that they did, and then the other person, if you talk to them, they have a completely different understanding. No, it was actually because of what so-and-so did, and I was just, defending myself, what have you, whatever the case may be. Or if, there's something horrible that, like an actual, in some cases, a crime that takes place in the family, it says, you did this. No, actually, I didn't even do that. You're blowing it out of proportion. That's not what happened. And then that festers, and it becomes a situation where we don't really want the truth to come out. We don't want all the information to come out. I want the narrative that serves my interest to be the dominant narrative, and that can only exist if I either silence you or obliterate your attempt to tell your narrative and your truth. And so we see that in families all the time. The thing is, we're now seeing that on a much larger scale, where it's essentially, we're not looking for any sort of synthesis or common ground or sense of let's actually talk about what's going on, or what happened, or what the problem is, or what the trauma is, what is the wound, but rather it's becomes a self-fulfilling, self-serving enterprise, where it's like, my narrative must prevail at all costs, and that can only happen if all other stories that somehow challenge my narrative are obliterated, and so the sense that we come to some sort of consensus, and that we can have a footing for some sort of reconciliation, whether it be the sense of the national family, a community, a church congregation, or even just the immediate family, that seems to be very, very, very far away from where we are at this point. And so I'm just curious, as you think about the topics you presented, how you would integrate this new reality, into how individuals or communities, can even begin the process of healing through narrative or storytelling.
Well, that's very interesting and very great, because I would say it starts with the idea of having a certain ego. This is who I am. And you have this certain ego, and then you want that to be reinforced. And that's a huge part of the dysfunctional relationships, because you get 2 people like that, 3 people like that in a family or whatever. They have a certain idea of who they are, and there are different characters, archetypes that they pick out. A lot of times they pick out the archetype of victim. Sometimes they pick out the archetype of the wise one. I'm the wise one. I know how to do everything. It's some archetype that's very tight, and it doesn't allow for real communication. The idea that I have this particular ego that's not flexible, or that is important, is a huge aspect of dysfunctional relationships. And I see it a lot. I work a lot in education, so I feel like education is a huge boon to looking at larger pictures, larger than your own needs and your own ideas. So I foster that a lot, and when you asked that question, what popped up in my head was a thing I'm going through right now, and I won't use, of course, the names. And I'm dealing with a family, and each member of this family, the mother, the father, and then there's one daughter, and they each think that they are absolutely correct in their story about what happened when the daughter made a decision to drop out of school. And it's just amazing example to look at what storytelling can be somewhat in the negative. And I'm interested in how do you probably fight fire with fire, perhaps, by developing narratives and stories that are healing and that connect people rather than separate them. So what we're talking about with this dysfunctional relationship are stories that are, as Megan was saying, they're not community shared, but they're stories that each individual has and wants to promote. I think we all know that when we argue. That's kind of what we're doing. But it's interesting to step back from that and say, and that's why, again, Socrates, know thyself, everything in moderation, and then certainty leads to ruin. I didn't understand that always, but boy, do I get it now. I'm certain this is what happened. Yes, it's hard to get through. And I'll just give you a couple of details because it's kind of interesting, I hope. But this is an incredibly intelligent girl, and I'm sending her, and I'm also have at this school, which will remain nameless, but you probably could guess. I'm set up a foundation for Native American and Alaskan Natives, but there are not many of those here. But to be able to have a scholarship. And it's not because I want them to be able to become successful mainstream people. It's because I think that their voices need to be in that community. So this girl is was called an outlier and all kinds of stuff in terms of her story, and she felt like she had no friends there. She's not Native American. This is not a Native American. As a matter of fact, she's Canadian, which is but so her story, when she's telling, and I think maybe all of us have experienced this, I feel like it's crazy making. When she tells her story, it sounds totally right and totally real. And so I'm listening to her story and going, oh wow, that's. And then the dean has her story, and I'm talking to her, and she seems like a really nice person. And I fall into, yeah, well, gosh, that must be the way it happened. And then the parents. And so all of these different stories, individual stories, are just perpetuating the dysfunctional relationship. And so it's interesting what Megan says, and even what you're talking about forgiveness. In these cases, the person has to first think that there may actually be something to forgive. And so that's maybe a step in some cases. Maybe I do need to be forgiven. And then, the next thing is to listen, of course. Listening is a huge part of all of this stuff we're talking about, is to listen to someone else. And just for a minute see this dangerous question for the ego. Could they be right? Maybe
impossible.
But that takes, and I'm sure it's so dendritic and so many layers. I'm sure there are stories, especially in Megan's work. There's stories where that's a theme of the story, is to listen and to go beyond what the individual's agenda is. It's really hard, and in these times, I would say do we ever feel like we're desperately connected to the idea that we are right and others are wrong, and we're scared, and that's a big part of it too, is fear. Is this fear that something terrible is going to happen. And so you have to, get over the fear, or not get over it, but you have to admit the fear, I suppose. And that's something that somebody in an individual dysfunctional relationship, think about, as I used, the famous play, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. What person in that argument, those stories that they're telling, is going to say, I'm really afraid. I'm really afraid. And that might be the start.
Well, and I'd say one of the things you can talk about is clinging on to a narrative, clinging on to a certain version of what is truth or what the wound is and that sort of thing. I mean, it comes from a place of fear of losing control of something, losing agency because I've lost control of the story, and therefore if I lose control of the story, then somehow maybe I lose control of my life. And I would say just the comment about Megan, what you were saying about getting beyond the one-on-one, it takes a community. And the question I have is, you use the image of sticking the hand in the wound of Christ, the wound in the side. What happens when arrows are used to keep the wound open? When you have factions within that community that they don't want to close the wound on some level, and then that becomes a very difficult thing to deal with. Because if there isn't a willingness, to heal, and this what loops back into the question of addiction, is that what happens when the real addiction becomes, the unhealthy narrative that we cling to, or the desire to, use that narrative as a justification to remain angry and bitter and resentful because we've mainlined that, and then that becomes the new drug. I might not be using a substance, but I still have my anger, and I'm not giving that up, that kind of thing. And so I think there's a lot of trapdoors for this conversation to continue, and I think we have somebody who would like to ask a question right now.
Yes, Dr. Horsley, just to follow up, you mentioned about one of the keys is listening, as well as the fact that there are often conflicting narratives. And maybe all of you can speak on this as well, about the power structure, how that works in this. Whether it's in the church, in education, or in a nuclear family, there is always a power structure. So, how can the person not in power deal with that issue when there are different narratives and when the other person needs to listen?
That's so interesting, and I think I'm going to pass it on after briefly saying to others, to Megan. I feel like one thing that I'm seeing in that incident I'm talking about is you enlist the power, the person with the power. You learn to tell the story in a way that then brings in the person that you think is going to be able to help or empower you. And then also I think of in my situation in my family of origin, you go outside for help. You go to some source outside. But I think what I'm noticing with this particular girl and her family is that it's a painful question for me in a way, because this is pretty raw. I see her completely capitulating to the powerful one, and I see that happening. And since the powerful one happens to be one of her parents, and I think that this parent is not healthy, but she's the powerful one. I just gave it away there. So I think that that's what happens, and I think, again, I would say coming up with programs. There's no program for this. I don't know what it would be called. There should be, but dysfunctional family program. If you go to that program, you're in trouble with your family. But you can. But I think the community is going to probably be really valuable in taking care of that kind of thing. But yeah, that's a tough one. So somebody. Maybe.
Well, I think you could bounce that same a version of that same question over to Megan. It sort of goes along with this idea of keeping the wound open. Is I guess the question was, the way I would look at it is, say you have the community is the solution ultimately to getting beyond sort of that individual level, and that it takes the community to heal. I guess what happens is, if within that community you do have a faction that has maybe more power than others in that community or in that group, that essentially mandates this is what healing is, this is what the story is, this is how we're defining the wound, and that's the end of it. And of course, then for everybody else, the trauma remains. That's an interesting, I think, conundrum that a lot of people deal with.
from the experience of the last 5 years, what I've learned from listening to everybody in the different communities, you have to get past the one-on-one. You have to get past your story, the individual story, being the root or the central connection to everything. And that means that every time you make a change, it must involve someone outside the one-on-one or the family or the counselor. All of them talk about you need an alternative community that rebirths you, teaches you. Basically, to go back to the story, Jesus was the one-on-one with all of them and with Thomas. But he did what he did with the witness of 10 others that were loosely involved. And that they say you need to, each time you move away from being controlled by the trauma, you move into a new group of people. They've come up with what they call the 4 H's. The first one is health. That 9 out of 10 times, besides a counselor, you need medical help. Whether it is to deal with an addiction, to deal with something psychological, but even to deal with the effects that the trauma itself had on you. And they are physical things that need to be dealt with. So they say the first thing you have to start working with is put someone in contact with different levels of medical and psychic care. That it needs to be dealt with that way. And that's the basic health one, that you can talk yourself to blue in the face, but if you don't deal with the effects that people have been living with for months and years, even decades, you're not going to get past anything. So the first thing you have to do is connect them to specific people where they can deal with that. The second one is much harder. They say it's honesty. And that's connected to the 10 disciples that are already a part of it. And they will very clearly say, there is no way in hell or heaven you can ever forgive yourself. You need to be forgiven by other people in order to make the next step out. Otherwise, you are trapped in a psychological reaction that there's no way out, except cold-bloodedly saying, I forgive myself. So they say you need other people to deal with your honesty and the effects it has on other people. As witnesses, Thomas needed to be forgiven. He needed to be forgiven by Jesus, but by confronting him the way he did, he had 10 other people forgive him, and vice versa. And so the second one is much harder to deal with. The honesty level of your life massively impacts others, whether you know it or not. What you do that's right and what you do that's wrong. And so that has to be dealt with. And again, they will keep coming back. You need an alternative family that operates as a new family, a new community. Not paid professionals, etc. They have to be human beings that you will live with. And that step out is part of that community that will make you and help you heal. And that, I even took notes on this because it's a little hard to explain. The second half of honesty is you have to start doing something different with different people. You verbalize what's going on, but you also, with other people, what are we going to do as the alternative? The people up there call it a treasure hunt. You look for power within you, virtue within you, possibilities of things you already know that you can use now with other people to start living an alternative life. And again, it's all done together. So that's the second one. The third one is hope. as oddly as that sounds. They say this one is like a quantum leap, that you begin to act against evil, act against your addiction, act against the effects that trauma has done on you, and that they are changes of lifestyle. They are changes of relationship, dropping relationships, walking away. It's big jumps, but that hope is a form of resistance, and that in order to resist what has been done to you and that you have gotten very good at doing, you must begin to hope for an alternative, a reality. And so you begin to resist it by acting against it, but it's acting. I love the line, I'm trying to remember, the gal who does all, I'm having an aging moment, the young woman who talks about climate change. She says you can talk about it and learn about it, but until you act, nothing happens. And I've forgotten her name. She's Greta. Yes. And so you have to, that's the third level of hope, that you start acting and resisting with others so that you basically form a new life. And that each stage begins to overlap as you do this. And the last one, believe it or not, is holiness, meaning the ancient understanding of W-H-O-L-E, wholeness, completeness, which is also another word for Jesus' word, peace be with you. May wholeness, may holiness, may peace be with you. That you, with others, again, each time it's with others, how do you live your new life with others? By blessing them and allowing them to bless you into new ways of talking, living. And oftentimes the jump between the hope and the blessing is, what can you do that creates beauty? Some form of art, some form of creativity, some new sense of imagination that you can use to actually do with other people. And so up there, they are doing many of their old traditions: weaving, pottery, sewing, gardening, food preparation, all sorts of things, but something that you do with others to create a new reality for you to live in. And so it's like, but they all entail making connections with other people outside of your immediate family, and or counseling anyone who you paid to help you or did a program with, that this is somebody you have to learn to live with. That the only thing that cures trauma, and they would say restores humanity or repairs what is broken, is to begin living with other human beings.
I think you want the mic?
Yeah,
Okay,
I
go
do.
for it.
I want to ask people that, because I think what Megan's talking about comes very much from community and from the communities that she works with. And I think what you and I are talking a little bit about, unfortunately, in some ways, is individual families and their dysfunction. And especially with a child of those families, it's hard for that child to be able to, in other words, I would love it if we had more of a communal, atmosphere in our world, for sure. But I think, I guess what I would ask you is, because I think self-forgiveness, I just don't see how a lot of people who are struggling with addiction, or in my case, this young woman, 15 years old, who has nothing but her parents to rely on. How does somebody self-forgive I really like to hear what you feel about that, because I think that's really important, the ability to forgive yourself. So, can you?
Well, I just think that's a part of the journey, that we have participation in our own narrative, so we kind of have to let go of the narratives we tell about ourselves. If we've decided that we're worthless, that's no way to operate either by yourself or in a community or in a family. What Megan was saying, I find in the experience that I get to teach in is this community experience, and I agree. I think that is very much a part of the healing, is it's done in community. The whole 12-step program is based on folks saying, you know, we have a shared story. And I was thinking about one of the other pieces that you brought up, Megan, with regards to blessing. In this program where I teach, there's also another program where there are young mothers who are either pregnant or just had their babies, and they're in this substance abuse recovery program with lots of other different ages and different groups. And at first it was a little unnerving, because, you know, the babies would be screaming at the top of their lungs when we're trying to do some work. And then later I realized what was happening was that was an element of hope that was occurring within this community that is just together for a brief period of time. But there was something hopeful that was happening when these young mothers had their babies with them in this group that changed the nature of the entire community itself. So there, and you know, being able even to offer a blessing when a new baby has been born with this group, their community, their church at this particular time in their lives, has been very important and healing as a part of our time together. So, you know, I think it's all related. I think we can't, you know, we do it in our own stories, but we also certainly must do it in the community's story as well.
I think that's a really good point. And something I was kind of going through my mind was thinking about this notion of self-forgiveness and then being forgiven by others is the sense that for some, I think, you know, maybe now more than ever, but it's the sense that, you know, I forgive myself according to the story that I want to tell about myself. And that when I ask for forgiveness, you know, I already have sort of a role scripted for you, how you're supposed to forgive me, what that sounds like. And then when I don't, and it's transactional, and when I don't hear that, you know, it's like, I'm sorry I did this, or sorry, you know, I was an addict and I did all this harm, or I did this or did that. And then in my mind, the person's supposed to say, oh, that's fine, you know, it's forgotten. And then when that doesn't happen, they say, no, you actually did a lot of harm. And you really need to know that. And some of us were going to be angry at you for a while. Some people, suddenly it's like, wow, that's not the role I assigned for you. You were supposed to forgive me unconditionally. And then it can either turn into resentment, or it can turn into a shame loop where it's like, well, I guess I am unforgivable, unlovable, and so on and so forth. So they think there's always a control aspect to, you know, the expectations we have about the stories that other people, you know, might believe, you know, and that, you know, I can forgive myself, or I can accept forgiveness as long as it comes in the package that I like. And the comment I was going to have about Megan, you know, you talk about doing something creative in community as a way of healing. You know, we're now at a place where people are ending marriages and long-term romantic relationships because one partner doesn't have the same political, ideological view as the other, and so they're leaving them at the altar and all that. Actually, this just happened on TV not that long ago, and so I'm wondering, are we almost getting to a place where, you know, if you know, the sense, I think the question that Megan posed is, can I live with this other person? Can I live with these other people? Maybe in some cases that are different from me in this and this way. And I think in some ways, and I speak, you know, somebody just living in American society here, we seem to be coming to a place where, no, I'm not going to do any basket weaving with somebody that voted for so-and-so. You know, and it sounds humorous, but actually that's kind of happening. You know, and so I just find it, you know, that's why we're, you know, the idea of what are the stakes of this conversation going forward, that was kind of one of the operative orienting questions for the symposium. You know, we're getting to a place where even some of these most basic things are kind of breaking down in our capacity, you know, to relate to one another on any sort of level. So I'm going to cut my remarks short there. Does anybody else have something they want to offer Father Gino?
Well, first of all, I'm in awe of the good work that each of you does with the people that you serve. Given the title of this program, God in Recovery, and God's grace at work in all of the good work that you do, where does prayer fit? Where do you refer to prayer as a way to nurture, God's grace in the good work that you do? I believe God's grace is very active and very profound. How do you nurture that grace in prayer?
I don't just work with the people in northwestern Canada. I work with the folks on the border. I work with families in New Mexico who are at the point of trauma of selling their older children into slavery so that their younger children might have a chance to live. So I'm working with the New Mexico State Police and the INS and all sorts of ordinary people dealing with this everywhere. And everyone is asking the questions. We are so individuated and so locked into tight communities of families. How do we reach out and make connections with other human beings? The smaller a group gets, the more problems become apparent and the problems deepen and worsen. And so the question is, trauma deals always with all kinds of groups of people, and we have to learn how to move anybody we're working with as an individual into another relationship, into another larger group of people, and that other people save us, always, and that there are things we have to do to respond, but we have to start thinking in terms of us and then we, rather than me and you, etc. So that it's a problem in all of society. The policemen I deal with, the EMTs I deal with, the Border Patrol I deal with, they're all dealing with how do we get people at odds who have experienced trauma on both sides, because the people who are arresting people at the border and all sorts of things, they're experiencing trauma in what they do as well as in what they do with other people. How do we make connections with people who are different than us, that we're primarily ignorant of or terrified of, and to reach across that? Trauma has so affected us that we don't know how to deal with most people because of the trauma we have experienced. So it's a question of always how do we move past wherever is right now with just this group, especially remembering that the most unlikely person is the one who's going to heal you. The most unlikely person is the one who is a blessing. Rather, the stranger, the outsider, the fringe person, that they're the real gift rather than perhaps somebody who's intervening. I know I'm talking about a shift in society, but it's also how do we live as human beings?
Okay, I'd like to answer your question. And what is the relationship with God? I would say for me, I guess, is it a personal question? Because I'm willing to answer the personal question. Okay. I would say my conversation and my relationship with God is constant in many ways. And I grew up as an Episcopal church, and it was, of course, with church services and prayers and that sort of thing. And I'm very glad for that. But I'd say that, I have a constant, I don't know whether I'd call it connection, opening with prayer, definitely.
He needs the mic.
Oh, yeah.
I'm thinking that how does prayer help us to hopefully endure the many difficulties that you deal with in your good work? How does it help you to endure in faith, in hope, and in love?
I'll just be really quick with this, and I'm going to hand it over to you. I basically just say, when I'm in a situation with anybody, God be with me, God help me.
I love your question, Father Gino, and I was remembering just recently when Lent has started with the group before we finished. This is with the older adults, and I asked them, Lent's beginning, so I'm going to be a little more intentional about my prayer life. How shall I pray for you? And I didn't know how they would receive even the question, but there was just this tenderness that occurred as each person shared a really personal thing, that whether it was like an injury on their foot or a relationship, and it was so precious and tender, and I was just making a list. I didn't really think it would open the conversation in a way that it did. But clearly what I experienced in the group is that they were longing to be asked that question. How can I pray for you? And it was, so thank you for the question, because that was recent and very meaningful. I also like to hear how other people pray or feel connected to the divine source. And then if we're in a ritual of some kind, would use the language that they use for their higher power or divine source.
Thank you. Well, I think this is the sense of prayer, and I'd say to tie that back in with this notion of narrative storytelling, spirituality, of course, healing from trauma, and ultimately, community healing. I mean, I think once again, we find ourselves in a very interesting place where, even the things like prayer can become bones of contention. Of course, we have multiple, religious traditions, and in Christianity, different denominations, and so forth. So, there's all sorts of different opinions and theologies, out there. That is not new. But I find even, in the sense of what we pray for, that there used to be, I think, a little bit more consensus amongst multiple faiths of, can we pray for, starting with the Old Testament, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, the Anawim, the most vulnerable in our midst. But now we can't seem to agree on who they are. Okay, and of course that's reflected in now in a mass media culture where we tend to tune into, watch versions of the news, narrative stories, as it were, where we agree with that particular version of who the victim and the perpetrator are. Who is causing the wound? Well, I'm going to watch this network or this podcast because it comports with how I want to think about this particular issue. And unfortunately, we find, I think, that even prayer, in a collective setting, you would think that would be a unifying instance, so that even in and of itself is becoming difficult. And we for example, in my Catholic faith, we have a portion of the liturgy of the hours, as well as the Mass, where you have the prayer of the faithful, where you have various intentions, where now that has to be sanitized in such a way that nobody is offended by the intentions. Where, and I've heard this, myself, where, one person will offer an intention, for example, we pray for, our, the immigrant community, that they may be treated with respect and love and compassion and feel safe and so forth, because that's a big issue now. And then you have the next person that offers an intention, again, sort of off the cuff. It's like, and I want to pray for all those people that have been victimized by illegal immigrants and so on and so forth. I wish I could say I'm making this up. I'm not. Okay. that really, I think that, if you were to go back about even just like say 10 years, even not to say that we didn't have polarities 10 years ago, what have you, but that never would have happened at a liturgy. And so now we have to make sure that all our intentions are so sanitized that any sort of potential for being, misconstrued as some sort of politicized, football, as it were, that it's all kind of milquetoast. And so once again, it becomes, as we were talking about at the beginning, the unspeakable. It's like, well, we can't talk about that, we can't raise that, we can't pray for these people, we can't pray for those people because somebody's going to get upset about this and somebody's going to feel excluded about that. And so the terms of the conversation, we can't even agree on the narrative. We can't even get to a place where let's pray for healing because we don't even know what we're healing from. We don't even know what the wound is. We know we're all wounded, we're all broken, but we don't really know, we can't really agree what it is. I mean, is my arm broken or is it my leg? I'm hurt, but I'm not sure how. I mean, again, it's an absurd example, but, that seems to be where we're landing. And so I think, to get back to what Megan was talking about, the idea of a healing as a community. Can we do anything together as a community when we can't even, really agree on the terms of the conversation or what a community is? It's extremely challenging. And hence, again, the idea of the timeliness of what we're talking about. I don't think the stakes could really be any higher. And so anybody else want to offer something? Megan?
Lots of people say you're known by the company you keep. And basically, they're the people who are your community, who we keep company with. And I travel a great deal around the world. And I was in Japan once. And the people in LA, who I was going to do a conference with, said, we need your description of your workshop right now. And this is before emails and all that kind of stuff. And I thought, so I did call them, it cost a fortune. And as I got on the phone and said, I think I have it together, take dictation, I'll give you the description of the workshop. And the woman on the other end of the phone said, don't bother, we wrote it ourselves. I said, you what? They said, we wrote the description of your workshop for you. I said, how in the world did you do that? And she said, we decided you're one of them. I nearly dropped the phone. But it was true. The company we keep, the people we hang around with, the people we spend time with, the people we serve, the people we listen to, they're the folks that are our community. And they're the people, that we pray for, as well as for our enemies and everybody else. Prayer is as much who you stand with as any words that you say. And I'd say practically everybody really knows that.
I would say, when we pray for enemies, though, sometimes I think what we're really praying for is, God, make my enemies like me. And I think there's a term for that, assimilation. Other comments or questions, or anybody, or from our panel, or from attendees?
I can end with a story.
Well,
True story.
Going once, going twice, okay.
This is a story from the late 1880s by two people. If you don't, you probably know of them. Auguste Renoir and Henri Matisse. They were very, very good friends, incredible painters. Henri Matisse was 26 years younger than Auguste Renoir. But they spent a lot of time together and talked about art and whatever. But for the last 17 years of Auguste Renoir's life, he suffered from debilitating arthritis. The last 10 years was in a wheelchair. He never left the wheelchair or the garden that he painted in. But he kept painting. And every day Henri Matisse would visit him, and he'd watch his friend in agony. That every time he picked up a brush, made a stroke, he could see the grimaces on his face, his hands shaking, and they talked about all sorts of things. And finally, one day, he said to him, why do you keep painting when you are in such pain? Why? And Auguste Renoir looked at him and said, the pain passes, the beauty remains. And I have used that story for every awful place I have ever been, that somehow this hope of making a quantum leap in our own lives, of doing something, resisting evil, resisting trauma, to do something that is beautiful, that will be a gift for someone else with other people, somehow is a major part of dealing with all our trauma. To do something together with others that creates beauty. The pain does pass, but the beauty does remain.
Well, I think that's a good note to conclude on, and just to double down, I think hope is kind of the thing that has to spring eternal. Because if we can't hope in the possibility of healing with the grace and the help of God, then God help us. Well, I want to say thank you to our panel again, Dr. McKenna, Dr. Kate Horsley, Reverend Lynne Hinton, again, noted authors all. We have their works over at the tables there if anybody would like to pick up a copy of one of their books. I just think this has been a fantastic lecture series this year. I think it was a fantastic concluding symposium, and also for those of you who are watching this at home. Spread the word. If you want more lectures, please tell the Norbertine community that we would be interested in seeing this. And also, we want to keep the lectures free, so people donations are always welcome for that. All our products are thus far are sold without tariff, so but we want to keep the costs down as much as possible. But we always want this to be a free event because we believe it's edifying for the community, for people of faith and people that are seekers, everyone. And so we want to keep doing this because we feel that this is indeed a key part of what the Abbey does. And I just want to conclude by saying it's not just me that organizes this. We have a whole team of people here at the Abbey that facilitate this. Our retreat center directors, Anthony Romero, Linda Sepulveda, of course, our communications director, Joe Sandoval, does a lot, especially with the electronic side of it. Everybody that sets up, for the events, and spreads the word and promotes, there's a lot of folks to thank. So it is a team effort to do these types of events. But we hope that we'll be able to continue offering, stimulating and timely content in the future. So for everybody that has supported us in these lectures, and again to our illustrious panel here, thank you very much. And that will conclude the 2024-25 Norbertine Library Lecture Series. Thank you.